December 13th, 1945. A cold morning at Hameln Prison in the British occupation zone. 3 women walked their final steps across a stone floor toward the gallows, toward the darkest chapter that history tries to forget, but never truly can. Irma Grese, 22, blonde and blue-eyed, once feared across Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Elisabeth Volkenrath, who supervised the daily machinery of death. Johanna Bormann, known to prisoners as the woman with the dogs. None of them shed a tear as the noose tightened. Albert Pierre Point, Britain's most skilled executioner, carried out the sentences with the cold precision of a surgeon's blade. By noon, all 3 were dead. But this moment was only the highest point of justice in the entire story, because when we step back, we see a larger, heavier, and far more troubling truth. Most of them walked free. That is the plain reality. Out of roughly 3,500 women who served as guards in Hitler's concentration camps, only about 15 women were executed, which was less than 0.5% of the more than 3,500 female guards. Between 70 and a little over 100 women served short prison terms and were released in the early years of the Cold War. Some former SS and Gestapo members, mostly men, were recruited by Western intelligence during the early Cold War. And the rest? They changed their names, moved to new towns, opened small stores, taught school, raised children, living peaceful lives while their victims spent decades searching for justice that would never come. Why did this happen? Why was the post-war world so quick to forgive? Or to forget? Did people simply want to believe that women could not be as cruel as men, even when the evidence said otherwise? When British tanks rolled through Bergen-Belsen's gates on April 15, 1945, soldiers climbed down to find more than 10,000 corpses scattered across the compound. Among the survivors were several female SS guards in grey uniforms who had not fled in time, and they were taken into custody by British troops. Brigadier Hugh Llewellyn Glyn Hughes, commanding the British forces, would later describe the scene as beyond anything witnessed in 5 years of war. The guards were immediately arrested and lined up for photographs that would become iconic images of post-war reckoning. British photographer George Roger captured them standing in formation, faces showing not remorse, but something closer to defiance or shock. Corporal Reginald Norris, who had fought from Normandy to the Rhine, watched the arrests with contempt. Years later he recalled, "They stood in line as if it were a changing of the guard. They weren't crying. One even asked for a cigarette. When we started taking photographs, some of them looked straight into the camera. They looked proud." Among those arrested was Irma Grese, transferred from Auschwitz months earlier. Survivors identified her immediately, the young woman who had selected them for gas chambers, whipped them for minor infractions, and unleashed trained dogs on prisoners too weak to defend themselves. She was 22 years old, but had already spent 4 years perfecting casual cruelty. The British weren't alone in their hunt. The Red Army liberated Ravensbrück on April 30th, 1945. Ravensbrück served as the main training center for female concentration camp guards, where several thousand women were trained before being sent to camps across Nazi-occupied Europe. Many had fled, but Russian soldiers captured dozens in surrounding villages, often hidden by relatives hoping Germany's collapse would shield them from retribution. The pattern of capture varied by location. British zones operated methodically. Each arrested woman was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a number at internment camps like. They were sent to British civil internment camps, including facilities such as Civil Internment Camp No. 5 at Staumühle, while investigations were carried out. The British maintained meticulous records, files still preserved in London's National Archives, filled with mugshots of women wearing numbered placards. American zones focused on intelligence gathering, wanting names and organizational details. Guards who cooperated found themselves in relatively stable facilities like Moosburg. Those who refused faced months of isolation designed to break their will. The Soviet approach was harsher. Having lost over 20 million people, Russians had little patience for legal proceedings. Some captured female guards were sent to Soviet detention or labor camps, while others disappeared from the historical record. Contemporary records, declassified decades later, document systematic abuse against SS prisoners regardless of age. Their membership in the extermination machinery marked them as targets for accumulated hatred. But for every captured guard, at least one slipped away. At Stutthof in northern Poland, investigators found a bonfire of papers and clothing, evidence of desperate attempts to erase incriminating records. At Auschwitz, evacuated in January 1945, many guards joined death marches or redeployed westward. Administrative offices yielded lists of 170 women assigned to different sectors, but dozens had already changed into civilian clothes, burned papers, and melted into refugee streams. Soviet security forces later reported that many former SS personnel, including women, avoided capture, often with help from relatives, as the post-war chaos made identification difficult in villages in eastern Germany. Several women initially captured as inmates were later identified as former guards only when survivors pointed them out. The chaos favored those trying to hide. With millions of displaced persons, cities in rubble, and record offices destroyed, someone with forged papers or changed clothing could easily disappear. Despite the confusion, Allies managed to capture and detain several hundred female guards in those first months. They were photographed, catalogued, and held while prosecutors determined their fates. Some would face swift military tribunals. Others would languish for months or years, uncertain whether they'd be tried, imprisoned, or released. Still others, perhaps the majority, would eventually walk free, their crimes unexamined. For guards accustomed to wielding absolute power, the reversal of fortune may have been psychologically crushing. One moment ordering prisoners to their deaths, the next standing in line for watery soup, sleeping on thin mattresses, enduring hostile stares from guards who knew exactly what they'd done. At Lüneburg, in summer 1945, the routine was deliberately designed to strip away authority. Women woke at dawn, cleaned barracks, performed housekeeping duties, then spent hours in interrogation rooms answering repetitive questions. Contact with the outside world was tightly controlled. Letters were censored and visits were very limited. So many prisoners felt deeply isolated. Some guards adapted disturbingly well. Prison reports describe women who cooperated fully, expressing what officials called moderate remorse, behaving impeccably. One report from April 1950 regarding Herta Bothe stated, "Prisoner Bothe has demonstrated good conduct, is cooperative with staff, and shows moderate remorse. Recommended for sentence review." Bothe had been sentenced to 10 years in prison by a British military court for her actions at Bergen-Belsen, after earlier service in other camps such as Ravensbrück. Witnesses at the trial described how she beat prisoners with wooden objects until they bled and drove work details in conditions so harsh that people died from cold and exhaustion. In her defense, she claimed that she had only done her duty and that she had not beaten prisoners hard, but had just tried to keep order. Within a few years, prison reports began to describe her as well-behaved and cooperative, and in December 1951, she was released early, after serving about 6 years of her 10-year sentence. British camps were strictly organized, but they were still prisons. The women lived in barracks behind barbed wire, received limited rations, and faced regular inspections. They were questioned again and again, sometimes about specific acts of brutality, sometimes about how the camp system worked, as Allied investigators tried to build cases against the wider Nazi apparatus. For high-profile prisoners like Grese and Volkenrath, treatment was harsher. They spent weeks in makeshift cells before formal charges, subjected to particular scrutiny. Grese's youth and appearance attracted morbid attention, but also made her a target for verbal abuse and constant hostility. One facility guard later recalled Grese maintained defiance throughout captivity, refusing emotion even when confronted with survivor testimony describing her crimes. Soviet camps were far harsher. Soviet authorities were often more focused on punishment than on formal legal procedures. Female SS guards captured by the Red Army faced brutal conditions, and in some documented cases they, like many German women, suffered sexual violence. The Soviets saw all SS personnel as directly involved in genocide and treated them accordingly. Many were sent on to forced labor camps with other German prisoners of war, where harsh discipline and near-starvation rations were common. American facilities placed strong emphasis on intelligence gathering and wanted detailed information about how the Nazi camp system worked. Prisoners who cooperated could receive better food, more freedom of movement, or other small privileges. Those who refused to talk often stayed in custody longer and could be kept in stricter, more isolated conditions, though this still remained far from the later Cold War style of sensory deprivation techniques. The psychological weight of uncertainty may have been the worst. Guards didn't know if they'd be tried, imprisoned for years, or executed. Allied legal systems were slow organizing formal proceedings, delays stretching months. Some women tried minimizing guilt during interrogations, claiming administrative roles or following orders. Others, confronted by witnesses, realized silence wouldn't work. Medical reports from British camps mentioned several guards developed psychosomatic disorders, severe insomnia, hysteria, selective mutism. But no systematic support programs existed. Priority was custody, not care. Behavioral differences emerged over time. Some maintained defiance, clinging to lost Third Reich ideology, insisting they'd done nothing wrong. Others begged mercy, claiming they'd been mere cogs in machines they never understood. There were some documented suicide attempts among imprisoned guards, although these seem to have been less frequent than among high-ranking male SS officers, many of whom killed themselves when they realized what punishment they might face. The military courtroom at Lüneburg in September 1945 was packed with reporters, observers, and survivors who'd traveled hundreds of miles to see justice done. 45 defendants sat in the dock, 16 of them women from Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz, facing charges of mass murder complicity, torture, gas chamber selections, and criminal negligence. The legal framework was unprecedented. The trial was conducted under a British military legal framework, which allowed individual camp personnel to be prosecuted for war crimes, and it reinforced the emerging principle that personal responsibility could not be avoided by rank or gender, establishing for the first time that individuals, regardless of position or gender, could be held personally accountable for systematic atrocities. Among the accused sat women whose names would become synonymous with Nazi camp excess. Irma Grese, wearing a simple dress, blonde hair pulled back, appeared younger than 22. Elisabeth Volkenrath maintained stony composure. Johanna Bormann, 52, seemed almost bored by testimony. Evidence was overwhelming. Survivor after survivor described what these women had done. Several survivors testified that Irma Grese participated in selection processes at Auschwitz, often alongside camp doctors, and their statements described how prisoners chosen during these rounds were later killed, pointing at women, sometimes randomly, saying, "That one, that one." Within hours, those women were dead in gas chambers. She did this with casualness. One might order coffee. Another witness described Grese's leather whip used on prisoners failing to greet her properly. If you didn't stand at attention, didn't remove your cap quickly enough, she'd whip you across the face. Some women lost their eyes. Others had permanent scars. And she'd smile while doing it. Testimony against Volkenrath was equally damning. As general supervisor at Auschwitz, then Bergen-Belsen, she coordinated gas chamber selections, directed collective punishments, designed work schedules causing exhaustion deaths. She signed papers sending hundreds to crematoriums. One survivor testified, "With coldness one orders supplies." Bormann's crimes were visceral. Known as the woman with the dogs, she'd trained attack animals to assault prisoners on command. Multiple witnesses described her unleashing dogs on women too weak to defend themselves, watching with apparent pleasure. Dogs were trained to attack at her slightest gesture. She'd point, they'd pounce. She watched like it was entertainment. Defendants' responses followed familiar patterns. Grese claimed she couldn't remember shooting anyone directly, but admitted she did shout for them to stay in formation during selections. Volkenrath insisted she had no choice, and names were sent by Dr. Mengele. Bormann said almost nothing, sitting passively through hours of testimony. The trial lasted 2 months. On November 17, 1945, verdicts were announced. 11 received death sentences, 5 of them women. 19 received prison terms from years to life. 14 were acquitted for lack of evidence. Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were sentenced to death by hanging, while other female defendants received prison terms or were acquitted due to lack of evidence. Executions occurred December 13th at Hameln Prison. Albert Pierrepoint had developed an efficient, supposedly humane method, a calculated drop causing immediate death through cervical fracture. His official report stated all 5 women were executed according to protocol, with no technical failures or excessive suffering. Grese maintained what Pierrepoint described as cool and defiant demeanor until the very end. Forensic Dr. James Wallace examined each body, certifying death was instantaneous. Bodies were photographed for legal records, then buried in unmarked graves within the prison cemetery. While the Belsen trial unfolded, Poles prepared their own reckoning. The Auschwitz trial in Krakow, late 1947, focused exclusively on the largest extermination camp. Among 40 defendants were 4 female guards: Maria Mandl, chief guard known as the Beast of Auschwitz; Therese Brandl, Louisa Dantz, and Alice Orlowski. Charges were specific and brutal. Mandl was accused of ordering executions, participating in selections, running the death block. Brandl faced testimony about brutality against pregnant women, beating them with metal rods, participating in separating children for gas chambers. Mandl's defense echoed Volkenrath's. "I had no choice. Names were sent by Dr. Mengele. I simply opened the block door." But Polish courts were unmoved. Following orders wasn't a defense when orders themselves were crimes against humanity. Mandl and Brandl were sentenced to death, executed January 1948. Dantz received life, Orlowski 15 years. The longest-running trials occurred in Hamburg between 1946 and 1948, targeting Ravensbrück personnel, the main training center. 38 women and 6 doctors faced charges in 5 separate trials. Dorothea Binz, training chief at Ravensbrück, faced 23 witnesses describing how she beat prisoners to death with her bamboo cane. One survivor testified, "She'd beat women until bloody, sometimes for smallest infractions, sometimes no reason, and she'd whistle children's tunes while doing it." Emma Zimmer was accused of overseeing gassing of prisoners deemed unfit for work. Ruth Neudeck, known among Poles as the Scourge, had led firing squads and participated in mass executions. Confronted with evidence, Neudeck offered standard defense. "If I didn't follow orders, I'd have ended up on gallows myself. That was camp law." The court's judgment in Binz's case was unequivocal. The court finds it proven beyond reasonable doubt that the accused beat, tortured, and murdered with full awareness of her actions. Her sadism was corroborated by 23 witnesses, whose testimony is consistent and credible. Dorothea Binz and Emma Zimmer were sentenced to death and executed in 1947, while Ruth Neudeck was convicted in a later Ravensbrück trial and executed in 1948. By the time major trials concluded in 1949, post-war research suggests that several dozen women were formally tried for concentration camp crimes, with some receiving death sentences and others long prison terms. 18 received death sentences, 30 received prison terms from years to life. But these numbers tell only part of the story. Of approximately 3,500 women serving as guards, fewer than 200 ever faced formal charges. The trials did accomplish something significant. These trials contributed to the growing legal understanding that individuals, including women, could be held personally responsible for mass atrocities, a principle later fully defined in international law. Death sentences against Grese, Mandel Binns, demonstrated women actively participating in genocide faced the same ultimate punishment as male counterparts. Many survivors of Bergen-Belsen later said that they met former guards living normal lives after the war. One woman, whose testimony was recorded in West Germany in the 1960s, described seeing a former guard working at a market stall in Hanover. The guard was older and dressed like any ordinary shopkeeper, but the survivor recognized her as a woman who had beaten prisoners and driven them to forced labor. When the survivor asked who the stall owner was, a local simply replied that she was a nice lady who gave discounts to regular customers. For the survivor, this moment felt like a second shock. The same person who had once marched women under blows was now selling flowers and chatting politely with neighbors. Helena would later testify about this during an attempted case reopening in 1963. "I was paralyzed. How could someone who marched us under blows every morning, who beat us till we bled, who sent women to their deaths, how could she be selling flowers? How could she be free?" The answer lay in legal loopholes, Cold War politics, and a growing willingness to move on. Herta Botha had received a 10-year sentence for her crimes at Ravensbrück and Bergen-Belsen, but prison records and post-war studies showed that her punishment was quietly reduced. By 1950, officials were already describing her as a well-behaved prisoner who cooperated with staff and showed some degree of remorse, and they recommended that her case should be reviewed. In December 1951, after serving about 6 years, she was released early. This report type was common among incarcerated female guards. Prison officials, perhaps influenced by gender stereotypes, often described even brutal guards as reformed and deserving leniency. By December 1951, Botha was free. She'd served 6 years of 10, barely enough time for victims to begin rebuilding shattered lives. The pattern repeated across Germany throughout the 1950s. Guards sentenced to 10, 15, 20 years found themselves released after serving fractions. The rationale was always the same: good behavior, cooperation, supposed remorse. Their participation in industrial-scale murder seemed to matter less as years passed and reconstruction urgency took precedence. The denazification process provided another release avenue. Many guards were classified as Mitläufer, passive sympathizers who'd gone along without really believing. This ignored survivor testimony about these same women beating prisoners, participating in selections, carrying out executions. American military governor Lucius D. Clay defended many releases in 1950 by arguing that not everyone convicted of war crimes had personally taken part in killings. Some, he said, had mainly performed secondary duties, and continuing to hold large numbers of such people in prison could damage the political stability of West Germany. Under this reasoning, many former female guards received reduced sentences or early release. Some, like Alice Orlowski, who had been sentenced to 15 years in the 1947 Auschwitz trial and was freed in 1957, were able to return to ordinary civilian work. Others, such as Hermine Braunsteiner or Erna Wallisch, also spent years living quietly before later investigations brought their names back into public view. Changing names was one of the ways former Nazis tried to disappear into post-war society. Historians have found many cases in which people with a Nazi past registered under new names, moved to different regions, and started new jobs. Erna Petri, for example, was the wife of an SS officer who personally murdered 6 Jewish boys near her home in occupied Ukraine. After the war, she lived quietly in East Germany, working on a state farm and raising a family, until the East German authorities investigated her in the early 1960s. She was tried in 1962 and sentenced to life in prison for her crimes. Some cases were almost impossible to untangle. In the 1970s and 1980s, journalists and investigators in both East and West Germany occasionally discovered former guards living under married or changed names, working in shops or small businesses. In several of these cases, the women refused to talk, and prosecutors could no longer reopen the files because of gaps in the evidence or because the legal time limits for prosecution had already expired. Legal obstacles were numerous and frustrating. For years, German law imposed minimal penalties for complicity versus murder itself. Proving specific guards personally killed someone was difficult without documentary evidence, and war chaos had destroyed many records. Until 1979, many crimes weren't imprescriptible under German law. After certain periods, they couldn't be prosecuted. A 1985 German Justice Ministry report acknowledged these failures. The combination of antiquated laws, lack of documentation, and limited political will prevented the full exercise of justice in many cases. Historian Johannes Tuchel summarized it. Female guards who survived did so thanks to 3 factors: their anonymity, their gender, which placed them outside the judicial spotlight, and the apathy of a Europe that quickly wanted to forget. The overall numbers still tell a grim story. Around 3,500 women served as guards in the Nazi camp system, but only a small fraction ever faced a court. Depending on how the cases are counted, historians estimate that somewhere between a few dozen and a couple of hundred female guards were tried, and only around 20 received death sentences. Many others received limited prison terms or were released early, and the great majority were never prosecuted at all, returning quietly to civilian life. If released guards represent justice failure, those recruited by Western intelligence represent something darker: calculated decisions trading justice for Cold War strategic advantage. By the late 1940s, as East-West tensions hardened, intelligence agencies sought any useful assets, sometimes including people recently on history's most monstrous regime's wrong side. The best documented case involves Hildegard Lechert, known at Majdanek as the Bloody Woman. Born Berlin, 1920, she'd initially worked as a nurse before SS assignment in early 1940s. She served at Ravensbrück, Majdanek, Auschwitz, building a reputation for extreme violence. Survivors testified against her, describing a woman whose face would change, addressing prisoners, taking on what one witness called a bestial expression. She'd whip women for minor infractions, kick pregnant prisoners' stomachs, saying, "Less scum is born that way," lead lines toward crematoriums while whistling children's tunes. She was released in 1956 as part of a broader political amnesty in Poland, which reduced or ended the sentences of many convicted war criminals. What wasn't officially described was the real reason. Documents declassified decades later by German intelligence, BND, reveal that between 1956 and 1958, Lechert was recruited by CIA and the Gehlen organization, BND precursor, to work as an informant in West Berlin. The rationale was coldly pragmatic. She spoke fluent German, Polish, basic Russian. She'd spent years in Poland, developed contacts, and regional knowledge. She'd demonstrated what one CIA assessment called field experience and ability to follow orders without hesitation. Later intelligence files indicate that some former camp personnel were evaluated for possible intelligence use. She was paid, protected from further prosecution, allowed to live freely in West Germany while people she'd tortured struggled rebuilding lives. This continued until 1975, when new evidence from Majdanek survivors allowed Polish authorities to request extradition. By then, political climate had changed. West Germany couldn't simply ignore such requests. The 1981 Dusseldorf trial became one of the longest post-war Nazi crime trials. Testimony was harrowing. One survivor described Lechert kicking pregnant women's stomachs, saying, "Less scum is born that way." Another described her leading prisoner groups toward crematoriums while whistling cheerful children's songs. In the West German trial, Lechert was convicted of complicity in the deaths of more than 1,000 prisoners and sentenced to 12 years, but the court ruled that her previous imprisonment had already fulfilled the sentence. She died in 1995, a free woman who'd never expressed remorse. Lechert wasn't alone. The Gehlen organization systematically recruited individuals with territorial knowledge. After her release, Lechert was briefly contacted by West German and American intelligence services, which explored whether she could be used as an informant, but available records suggest the cooperation was limited and short-lived, though names remain partially classified. One revealing BND document, titled Recruitment from the Sector of Former Nazi Functionaries, includes a section on women with Poland and Ukraine experience. The report notes with chilling pragmatism that these women's knowledge of customs, rural roots, and local slang, plus their authoritative training, makes them especially valuable for observation and intelligence gathering in hard-to-reach regions. Klaus-Dieter Müller, historian at Potsdam Institute of Military History, explained the logic. These weren't accidental decisions. It was strategy designed to build a network competing with the KGB. If that meant resorting to former war criminals, it was assumed a necessary evil. Cold War demands took precedence over justice demands. In 2011, the German government allowed independent historians to study previously restricted BND archives, which revealed how former Nazi affiliates had been employed during the early Cold War and the Nazi informant network. Revelations shocked many Germans believing their government had made a clean break with the Nazi past. The released records showed that many former Nazi collaborators worked for the BND during its early years, and while most were men, a small number of women with camp backgrounds were also identified. In May 1945, as Allied forces swept across Reich ruins, Germany was in chaos. Millions were moving. Refugees fleeing the Red Army, former prisoners seeking home, defeated soldiers avoiding capture, Nazi officials attempting disappearance. In this massive confusion, someone wanting to vanish could simply do so. For female SS guards not immediately captured, the Reich's collapse presented crisis and opportunity. The crisis was obvious. They'd participated in crimes surely resulting in prosecution if identified. But the opportunity was equally clear. With record offices destroyed, municipal archives burned, identification systems in disarray, a woman with luck and nerve could reinvent herself entirely. Escape methods varied, but followed predictable patterns. The simplest: strip off SS uniforms, burn incriminating documents, dress in civilian clothing, preferably from dead civilians or piles of murdered prisoners' possessions. Many simply walked out before Allied forces arrived, blending into refugee masses clogging roads. A Soviet NKVD report from May 1945 noted frustration that an unknown number of female SS personnel were hidden by relatives in eastern German villages. Red Army arrest records showed over a dozen women initially captured as inmates were later identified as former guards only after survivors pointed them out. Some had hidden in plain sight, dressed in prisoner uniforms, claiming victim status rather than perpetrator. The ease of obtaining false documentation in those chaotic months cannot be overstated. The Nazi bureaucratic system had collapsed, and with it, careful record-keeping that might have prevented false identity assumption. Women who'd served as guards could simply take dead civilians' papers, adapt Wehrmacht or German Red Cross documents, adopt common names drawing no attention. Municipal bombing had destroyed many civil registries, making identity verification nearly impossible. Post-war German files show many cases where former SS personnel applied for legal name changes or became impossible to trace under their old names. Historians agree that a significant number of former guards used new identities in the late 1940s. Some official files included notes like "not traceable under maiden or married name" or "suspected of residing in Hesse under false name," but follow-up was minimal. German authorities, overwhelmed with reconstruction and denazification, simply lacked resources to track down every name changer. While most escaping guards stayed in Germany, some made it much farther. So-called rat lines, clandestine networks smuggling wanted Nazis out of Europe, were used primarily by high-ranking male officials. These secret rat lines were mainly used by high-ranking male Nazis, but some researchers believe that a small number of female camp staff may also have escaped to South America with false papers. For now, only a few individual cases are documented, and the true scale is unclear. Some historians, including Mary Fölbrook, have described cases where former camp staff slipped out of Europe on ships to South America using false or borrowed passports. Research linked to the Simon Wiesenthal Center has also shown that Argentine archives contain many post-war arrivals with Red Cross travel documents, including German men and women whose exact wartime roles are still being investigated. The Red Cross had unwittingly facilitated many escapes by issuing travel documents to people claiming displaced person without nationality status. These women arrived claiming nurse, teacher, or housewife status, respectable professions raising no suspicion. Once in South America, they simply disappeared into large German expatriate communities. Efforts to track missing guards began earnestly in 1958, with creation of Zentralstelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen, the Central Office for Nazi Crimes Investigation. But by then, over a decade had passed, many trails gone cold. Results were frustratingly limited. Legal obstacles were substantial. German law for years imposed relatively light penalties for complicity versus murder itself. Proving specific guards personally killed someone required evidence often no longer existing. Until 1979, many crimes weren't imprescriptible. After certain periods, prosecution became legally impossible. In the grim catalogue of women serving as Nazi camp guards, Johanna Langefeld stands alone, not because she was innocent, but because she is the only known female SS guard whose escape from Allied custody was helped by former prisoners, but because she was the only female SS guard known to have been helped escaping Allied custody by the very prisoners she'd once supervised. Born Essen 1900 to a deeply nationalist Lutheran family, widowed at 26, she raised her son alone, surviving as a home economics teacher. She did not behave like the most fanatical female guards, but she was still a convinced Nazi Party member who shared many nationalist and anti-Semitic views common in her generation. In March 1938, she applied for a job as a guard at Lichtenberg, the first SS-run concentration camp for women. There she helped supervise women the regime labeled asocial, prostitutes, petty thieves, beggars, and quickly rose in responsibility. Later transferred to Lichtenberg, then Ravensbrück, by 1939 she'd risen to Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor. During her time at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz in 1942, something unusual happened. She developed a reputation among prisoners as different from other guards. Multiple survivor testimonies support this. Polish woman Wanda Wosenak, testifying 1947, described Langefeld in terms unthinkable for guards like Grese or Mandel. She never raised her voice at us. She listened when we spoke, which almost none of the others did. More than once she prevented women in our barracks from being taken to punishment cells. She wasn't a friend, we had no friends among SS, but she was different. Margareta Böber-Neumann, a German communist who'd survived both Soviet and Nazi camps, wrote in memoirs. She was authoritarian, certainly. She believed in discipline and order, but she wasn't inhuman. She had justice sense uncommon among SS women. I saw her intervene to stop excessive punishments. She was bothered by other women guards' sadism. These accounts don't absolve Langefeld of system participation. But within that system, witnesses say she maintained certain boundaries. No documented cases exist of her participating in gas chamber selections, beating prisoners, or casual cruelty characterizing many colleagues. When American forces captured her December 1945, they held her in a Bavarian prison camp before extraditing her to Poland in 1946 to face trial for Auschwitz activities. Held in Krakow prison in solitary confinement, while authorities prepared preliminary charges, overseeing prisoner transports, maintaining contact with doctors conducting experiments and selections. Then something remarkable happened. Former Polish prisoners began writing prosecutor letters on her behalf. Polish Institute of National Remembrance archives show between February and September 1946, at least 5 former prisoners sent letters arguing Langefeld shouldn't be convicted as a war criminal. Letters stated she did not participate in torture, acted as mediator between prisoners and SS administration, and attempted to protect some inmates from medical experiments. Signatory Zofia Galinska, a lawyer who'd survived Auschwitz, even proposed Langefeld be allowed to testify in defense of other prisoners facing collaboration charges. An extraordinary suggestion. On December 23, 1946, Johanna Langefeld disappeared from her Krakow prison cell. A confidential report filed that day, classified Operacja Ekran, described what investigators found. Cell found empty at 6:45 morning. Lock not forced. Prisoner's clothes folded neatly on the bed. The trail went dark in the Dębeniki district area, where several houses remained uninhabited after the war. The report noted escape was facilitated by prison staff, with active collaboration of at least 2 female administrative staff members, both former camp system inmates. The very women once under Langenfeld's supervision had helped her escape. Unlike other escapees quickly recaptured, Langefeld seemed to vanish. 1947 reports indicated American military government intelligence received word of a woman matching her description living in Munich with her sister. Subsequent 1960 German Internal Security Service investigations confirmed Langefeld had been living under her own name in Munich's Moosach district since 1957, after years hidden in a Bavarian convent. Remarkably, she was never arrested again. When West German authorities finally confirmed where she was living, they did not arrest her again. Historians suggest that letters from former prisoners, the difficulty of proving specific crimes, and limited political will in the 1950s all helped protect her from a new trial. She lived freely until death in 1974 at 73, buried without public ceremony. Andrea Riedel, Ravensbrück Memorial Director, commented on the case in 2011. It forces us to rethink our understanding of women's roles in camps. She was part of the system, yes, that cannot be ignored. But she also represented something unusual, someone who maintained some ethical boundaries even within an absolutely inhumane environment. Prisoners who helped her escape believed she'd protected them when she could. That belief meant something, even decades later. On December 13, 1945, Irma Grese was executed by hanging at Hameln Prison, and her death marked one of the most visible outcomes of the Belsen trial. Justice was served, but only in the narrowest sense. Grese was 22, and she was convicted for her role in camp brutality and in selection procedures that sent many prisoners to their deaths, and survivors also described repeated beatings and abuse. Her execution, along with Volkenrath's and Bormann's, made a clear moral statement. These crimes would not be tolerated. But thousands of other women whose actions were equally real and horrific never faced trial. Historians estimate that about 3,500 women served as camp guards, and while some were tried and punished, many others were never prosecuted, and the exact totals differ across countries and records. Hundreds vanished through name changes, and many more simply walked away. Some, like Herta Bod, received prison sentences but were released early, and they later returned to ordinary lives away from public attention. Others, like Hildegard Lachert, were later contacted and evaluated by Western intelligence services, and some records suggest brief cooperation, although the full details remain disputed. Many disappeared completely. Post-war chaos made reinvention easy, and Cold War priorities often came before justice. Gender stereotypes and legal limits also reduced accountability, while a tired Europe focused on rebuilding instead of long investigations. For survivors, this felt like betrayal. Many survivors later learned that some of the people who abused them were living freely, and that discovery felt like a painful betrayal, which sent a painful message. Their suffering mattered less than society's desire to move forward. The trials that did occur still set an important precedent. Individuals, men or women, could be held responsible for crimes against humanity. Names like Grese, Mandel, Binz, and Volkenrath became symbols of the regime's brutality. But for every Grese who was hanged, many others served little time or disappeared completely, and the gap between crimes and consequences remained wide. The story of captured SS women is not only about justice, it is about the limits of justice, about how political needs and human exhaustion allowed terrible crimes to go unpunished. Some faced gallows, some served prison years, some were recruited as Cold War spies. Most simply disappeared into post-war German society's fabric, living quiet lives while carrying terrible secrets. They married, raised children, worked ordinary jobs, died in old age with crimes known only to themselves and survivors who could never forget. The question we're left with isn't just what happened to these women, it's why we allowed it. Why did justice arrive slowly for some, not at all for most? Why did strategic calculations outweigh moral imperatives? What does it say about our accountability commitment when thousands of perpetrators can simply fade away, their crimes acknowledged but unpunished, their victims' justice demands left forever unmet? These are uncomfortable questions without simple answers, but they're questions we must ask, because failure to achieve justice for Nazi regime crimes wasn't just a historical anomaly, it was a choice. Thousands of small choices by prosecutors, judges, intelligence officers, government officials deciding other priorities mattered more than holding everyone accountable. Some women were tried, convicted, and executed in different post-war courts, including the hangings at Hameln after the Belsen trial, and these cases became the best-known examples of accountability. But they were the exception. For most SS women participating in the Holocaust, there would be no reckoning, no accountability, no justice, just quiet return to normal life while victims spent remaining days living with memory of what was done and knowledge that most who'd done it would never pay any price. That's the real story of what happened to SS women after World War II. It should trouble us deeply, reminding us even most horrific crimes can go unpunished when we lack will, resources, or courage to see justice through to its end. If this story of justice denied and accountability abandoned troubles you as much as it should, subscribe to our channel. We bring you the untold stories of history, the ones that are uncomfortable, complex, and essential to understand. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss the stories that shaped our world and continue to echo in our present.